She was just walking home when a police officer pulled her over and decided she could afford a little extra. The young officer flirted and then started groping her, thinking that in front of him was an ordinary girl with no connections. But he didn't know one thing. Her father is the head of the city's police force. What happens when the truth comes out? This confrontation will change everything. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this that open your eyes to injustice. Write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The evening breeze brushed gently against Layla's skin as she walked out of the cafe, the soft hum of conversation fading behind her. She tugged her jacket tighter around her shoulders, not because it was cold, but because she savored the comfort. Tonight had been exactly what she needed. A night with friends, laughter, and stories to take her mind off the weight she constantly carried. Layla loved moments like these, rare instances where she could just be without anyone expecting her to perform. It wasn't that her life was miserable, far from it, but being the daughter of the city's police chief, Jonathan Monroe, came with pressures most people couldn't imagine. Expectations clung to her like a second skin, and no matter how much she tried to peel them off, they always remained. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the pavement. Layla lived just a few blocks away, a short walk through the familiar territory she had traveled countless times. As she strolled, she thought back to the conversations from earlier that evening, light-hearted banter about school, their favorite new artists, and future plans. Her best friend, Mia, had teased her about her father's influence. "Girl, it's like you got a VIP pass through life," Mia had joked, laughing. "Bet you never have to worry about parking tickets." Layla had laughed along, but only out of politeness. Mia meant well, but she didn't understand. There was no VIP pass for Layla. Her father's position didn't make her life easier. It made it harder. She had to be twice as careful, twice as composed. Every mistake she made would reflect not just on her, but on him. The thought weighed heavily on her now as she walked, her sneakers tapping softly against the concrete. Jonathan Monroe was a good man, strict but fair. He had always tried to instill in her a sense of discipline and responsibility, constantly reminding her of the importance of justice. "It's not just about doing what's right when it's easy, Layla," he would say. "It's about standing firm when it's hard." She respected him deeply, but his shadow was long, and she often felt lost within it. Layla wanted to find her own way, carve out her own identity, separate from his towering reputation. But it was hard when everyone around her saw her not just as Layla, but as the police chief's daughter. As she turned onto a quieter street, a cool breeze lifted her dark curls, making them dance around her face. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath, letting the night air fill her lungs. These quiet walks were her escape, her sanctuary. No titles, no expectations, just the sound of her footsteps on the pavement and the freedom to think. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, a message from her father. "Home soon," it read. Layla rolled her eyes but smiled. He never stopped checking in on her, no matter how busy his schedule got. She loved him for it, but at the same time she wished he could understand that she needed room to breathe. "On my way," she texted back, tucking the phone into her jacket. She was only a few minutes away now. That's when she heard it, the low hum of an engine slowing beside her. A police cruiser rolled to a halt a few feet ahead, and Layla's heart skipped a beat. The window rolled down, and a man leaned his head out, his eyes glinting under the dim streetlights. "Evening," the officer said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge Layla couldn't quite place. Layla offered a polite nod. "Evening." She didn't stop walking, hoping the encounter would end there. But the officer's voice followed her. "You're out late, aren't you?" he called, a hint of a grin playing at his lips. Layla glanced over, her guard rising. "Just heading home," she said, keeping her tone neutral. The officer pulled the cruiser closer to the curb and got out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Randy. His posture was too casual, too familiar for her liking. Something about the way he moved made Layla's skin prickle with unease. "Mind if I walk with you?" Randy asked, as if it were a request, though the way he stood in front of her said otherwise. Layla kept her voice calm, but her pulse quickened. "I'm fine, thank you. It's just a few blocks." But Randy didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her in a way that made her uncomfortable. "It's not safe for girls like you to be out here alone," he said, the grin still on his face but now with an undercurrent of something darker. "Let me make sure you get home safe." Layla felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew this type. The kind of man who wore his uniform like a shield, using it to push boundaries without consequence. "No need," she said firmly, stepping to the side, but Randy mirrored her movement, blocking her path. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, his voice dropping into something closer to a whisper. "I'm just trying to be friendly." Layla's heart raced. She knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Not when it was just the two of them out here. "I appreciate the concern, Officer Randy," she said, keeping her voice level. "But I'm good, really." He didn't budge. Instead, he took a step closer, invading her space. His gaze drifted down her body, lingering too long on her legs. "You're real pretty, you know that?" he said, his grin widening. "Bet you get that a lot." Layla's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay composed. She needed to de-escalate, but every instinct screamed at her to run. "I really need to get home," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Randy's grin faltered for a second, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "What's the rush?" he asked softly, his hand brushing her arm as if by accident. The touch sent a chill down her spine. Layla took a step back, her heart pounding. "My father is expecting me," she said. He's the police chief." For a moment, Randy's expression flickered with something. Surprise, maybe doubt. But then it was gone, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The police chief's daughter, huh? That's a good one." Layla clenched her fists, every muscle in her body tense. She knew she had to tread carefully. If she said the wrong thing, this could spiral out of control. "I'm serious," she said quietly. "If you let me go, there won't be any trouble." Randy chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "See? Trouble's already here, sweetheart, and I'm the one who decides how much worse it gets." His hand lingered too long on her arm, and Layla felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She had to get out of this, now. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Look, officer, I don't want any problems. I just want to go home." Randy's grin twisted into a smirk. Too late for that. He reached for her wrist and Layla knew. This was only the beginning. The grip on her wrist tightened, sending a jolt of fear through Layla's body. Officer Randy's expression had shifted from smug amusement to something more sinister. She yanked her arm back instinctively, but his grip was firm, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. "Let me go!" Layla demanded, her voice sharper now, betraying her rising fear. Randy's grin widened, a predatory glint in his eyes. Feisty, aren't you? You really should learn to relax, sweetheart. I'm just making sure you're safe. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to step away, but Randy moved closer, towering over her. He reeked of overconfidence, drunk on the authority his uniform gave him. You don't need to touch me, Layla said, keeping her voice as firm as possible despite the fear bubbling inside. I haven't done anything wrong. He leaned in, his breath hot on her cheek. Wrong? I'll decide what's wrong around here. His fingers slid down from her wrist to her hand, a gesture that was as unsettling as it was invasive. The streets were eerily quiet, the distant hum of the city feeling worlds away. Layla glanced around, desperate for someone, anyone, to witness what was happening. But the street was empty. No witnesses, no escape. Randy chuckled, enjoying the way she stiffened under his touch. Don't be like that. I'm just being friendly. You're too pretty to walk around alone at night. She pulled her hand away forcefully this time, and for a moment, Randy's smug grin faltered, replaced by a flash of annoyance. I told you to let me go, Layla hissed, her pulse racing. Randy's expression darkened. You really think you can talk to me like that? I'm trying to help you, and this is the thanks I get. Without warning, he grabbed her arm again, this time with more force, jerking her toward him. Layla's heart leapt into her throat as she struggled against his grip. You're resisting arrest now, Randy sneered. That's a serious offense. Arrest? Layla's voice cracked with disbelief. I haven't done anything. He yanked a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink of steel sending chills down her spine. I'll decide what you've done, sweetheart. Stop it, Layla shouted, panic creeping into her voice. You can't do this. He laughed, a low, menacing sound. Watch me. As he slapped the cuffs onto her wrists, a small crowd began to gather from nearby buildings. People watched from a distance, silent, hesitant to interfere. The weight of Randy's authority silenced any potential protests. Layla looked desperately toward the onlookers. Please, someone help me. But no one stepped forward. They all looked away, unwilling to get involved. You see, Princess, Randy whispered in her ear, nobody's going to help you. They know better than to mess with the law. Layla's breath hitched, anger and fear swirling in her chest. She fought against the rising sense of helplessness, knowing she had to keep her wits about her. My father will hear about this, she said through clenched teeth. He'll know what you did. Randy chuckled. Sure he will. But for now, you're coming with me. He shoved her toward the patrol car and Layla stumbled, nearly falling. The metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists, cold and unforgiving. Get in, Randy ordered, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. She hesitated for a moment too long, and he grabbed her by the shoulder, roughly pushing her into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the small, suffocating space. The interior smelled of old leather and disinfectant, a scent that did little to calm her fraying nerves. Layla's heart pounded against her ribs as she struggled to catch her breath. The streetlights blurred through the dirty window as Randy slid into the driver's seat, whistling a jaunty tune. The car lurched forward, and Layla felt the crushing weight of her situation settle in. Her mind raced. She needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. You're making a big mistake, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Randy glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his grin widening. The only mistake here is thinking you're special, little princess. Layla clenched her fist, the cuffs biting into her skin. Memories of her father's advice echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Think before you act. Control what you can control. But right now, everything felt out of her control. They sped through the city streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Layla tried to focus, to think of a way to contact her father. But her phone was gone, confiscated by Randy before she got in the car. Minutes felt like hours as the car snaked through side streets, avoiding the more populated areas. The further they drove, the more isolated Layla felt. "You know," Randy said, glancing at her again, "you should really learn some manners. Might save you a lot of trouble." Layla glared at him through the metal grate separating them. "What do you want from me?" He smirked. "Just doing my job." "You call this your job?" Layla shot back, her voice laced with disbelief. Randy shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "Keeping the streets safe." They pulled into an alley, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. Layla's pulse quickened as she realized they weren't heading to the precinct, not yet. Randy turned off the engine and twisted in his seat to face her, a twisted grin on his lips. "Before we get to the station, let's have a little chat." Layla's stomach churned. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Randy leaned closer, resting his arm on the back of the seat. "It's simple," he said, his voice low and smug. "You behave, and maybe this little incident disappears. Cause trouble, and, well," he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. "You can't do this," Layla whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "I can do whatever I want," Randy said softly, his grin widening. "That's the beauty of it." Layla swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy fog. She knew she was in deep, and the only person who could pull her out of this was her father. But would he find her in time? The sound of a radio crackling alive broke the tense silence. Randy cursed under his breath and picked up the receiver. "Got a suspect in custody," he reported casually. "Female, early 20s, resisting arrest. Bringing her in now." Layla's hands clenched in her lap as she listened, rage building inside her. He was framing her, twisting the situation to fit his narrative. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice steady now despite the storm brewing inside her. Randy chuckled, a dark, sinister sound. "We'll see about that." The car roared back to life, and they sped off toward the precinct, leaving the alley and any hope of escape behind. The patrol car pulled into the precinct parking lot, its headlights casting harsh beams across the cracked asphalt. Layla sat rigid in the back seat, her heart thudding against her ribs. The weight of the cuffs around her wrists felt heavier with each passing second. Her breathing was shallow, fear curling inside her chest, but she held on to her father's words from years ago. In moments of fear, you think first. You don't let it control you. Randy parked the car with a jerk, glancing back at her through the cage separating them. "Let's get you introduced to the boys inside," he sneered, clearly relishing the power he held in this moment. He yanked the door open, grabbing her arm to pull her out roughly. Layla stumbled but caught herself before she fell, her wrists aching against the cold metal restraints. A few officers smoking outside the precinct door turned their heads toward them, eyes narrowing with confusion. "Who's that?" one officer asked, frowning. "Picked her up for resisting arrest," Randy replied with a casual shrug, as if this were just another routine incident. "She got mouthy. Figured I'd bring her in." Layla shot the officers a desperate look, silently begging them to intervene. One of them hesitated, clearly unsure about Randy's version of events, but none of them stepped forward. The unwritten code of loyalty among officers weighed heavily in the air. Randy pushed her forward, leading her through the precinct's doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, cold glow on everything they touched. The front desk sergeant raised an eyebrow as they entered. "Another one, Randy," the sergeant muttered, glancing over Layla with disinterest. "What's the story this time?" "Resisting and disorderly conduct," Randy replied with a smirk, as if it were all just a game to him. The sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork, scribbling down notes. "Put her in holding. We'll process her later." Layla's pulse quickened. She couldn't let this go any further. She had to act before things spiraled completely out of control. "You don't understand," she said, her voice sharp. "My father—" Yeah, Randy interrupted, tightening his grip on her arm. "We've heard it all before, sweetheart." Just as he started dragging her toward the holding cells, the doors of the precinct burst open behind them with a sharp clang. "Layla!" Her heart leapt at the sound of her father's voice. She turned her head, and there he was, Jonathan Monroe, tall and commanding, his presence filling the room with authority. His usually calm expression was gone, replaced by fury and fear as he took in the sight of his daughter in handcuffs. The room went still. Every officer within earshot froze, eyes darting between Randy and the police chief. "What the hell is going on here?" Monroe barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Randy's grip on Layla's arm loosened slightly, but the smug look on his face didn't waver. "She was resisting arrest," he said coolly. "Had to bring her in." Jonathan's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscle twitched. "Take those cuffs off her, now." Randy hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly weighing his options, but the presence of the chief, combined with the growing silence among the officers, forced his hand. With an exaggerated sigh, Randy pulled out his key and unlocked the cuffs. Layla rubbed her sore wrists, glaring at Randy with a mix of anger and relief. Her father stepped between them, placing himself firmly in front of his daughter like a shield. "Explain yourself," Jonathan demanded, his voice low but dangerous. "Why is my daughter in cuffs?" Randy crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "She was out late, acted suspicious. I stopped to check on her, and she got aggressive. Simple as that." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious? My daughter?" His voice dripped with disbelief. "And you thought the appropriate response was to arrest her?" "She refused to cooperate," Randy said, a hint of defiance creeping into his tone. "Didn't exactly give me much of a choice." Jonathan took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Randy's. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and the other officers shuffled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. "You listen to me, Officer Randy," Jonathan said, his voice steady and cold. "You're going to give me the truth right now, or I swear, by morning, you won't have a badge to hide behind." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Randy's face. He glanced around the room, looking for support from his fellow officers, but none of them came to his aid. They all knew better than to stand against Chief Monroe. "Look, I didn't know who she was," Randy muttered, his arrogance cracking. "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Jonathan repeated, his voice filled with controlled fury. "You laid your hands on my daughter. You arrested her for no reason. That's not a misunderstanding. That's abuse of power." Randy shifted uncomfortably, but kept his mouth shut. He knew there was no talking his way out of this now. Jonathan turned to Layla, his expression softening slightly. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though the tension in her body hadn't fully released. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the ache in her wrists and the weight of what had just happened lingered. "I'm taking her home," Jonathan said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He shot one final glare at Randy. "We'll deal with this later." Randy opened his mouth as if to protest, but the look on the chief's face silenced him. As Jonathan led Layla toward the exit, the room remained eerily quiet. No one dared speak. The only sound was the steady click of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of relief and lingering fear swirling inside her. Her father's presence had saved her this time, but she knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Once they were outside, Jonathan turned to her, his expression a mixture of concern and anger. "I'm sorry this happened, Layla. I never thought—" "It's not your fault," she interrupted softly, though the truth weighed heavily between them. But it was his fault, in a way. Not because of anything he had done, but because of the system he was part of. The system that had given men like Randy the power to act without consequence. As they reached his car, Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with guilt. "We'll make this right," he promised. "I won't let him get away with this." Layla nodded, though she knew it wouldn't be that simple. It never was. They both understood that this incident was just a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that wouldn't be solved with a single confrontation. But as her father opened the car door for her, Layla made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let this slide. She wouldn't let Randy, or anyone like him, think they could get away with treating her, or anyone else, that way. This was only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. The silence in the car was deafening as Jonathan drove through the empty streets, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Layla sat beside him, staring out the window, the events of the night replaying in her mind over and over like a broken film reel. The weight of Randy's actions pressed heavily on her chest, but even worse was the knowledge that, without her father's intervention, she might still be in that holding cell, powerless. They both knew that this wasn't just a personal slight. It was a symptom of something much deeper. Randy's abuse of power was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that had fostered arrogance and racism under the guise of authority. The realization left Layla's stomach in knots. When they arrived home, Jonathan cut the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Layla could see the storm of emotions in his face, guilt, anger, and frustration swirling beneath his composed exterior. "Layla," he began, his voice low and measured, "what Randy did tonight, it's not just unacceptable, it's criminal." "I know," she whispered, her voice steady but heavy with anger. "We can't let him get away with this." Jonathan nodded, the weight of his responsibility evident in his eyes. "This won't be easy. Men like him, they have a way of protecting each other. There will be pushback, maybe even from within the department." "I don't care," Layla said firmly. "I want him held accountable, not just for me, but for everyone like me." Her father's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of pride crossing his face. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll do this together, but you need to be prepared. This fight is going to get ugly." Layla took a deep breath and nodded. She knew what was at stake and she was ready. The next morning, Jonathan was already on the phone when Layla entered the kitchen, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs. He was speaking in a low, urgent tone, clearly briefing someone on the situation. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, waiting until he hung up. "We're launching an internal investigation," he told her, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've already spoken with the department's inspector general, but Randy's been on the force a long time. He has allies." "Corrupt allies," Layla muttered bitterly. "Some," her father admitted, "but not all of them. They're good officers, too, and they won't let this slide. We just need to be smart about how we move forward." Before Layla could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and froze. "It's online," she whispered, her heart racing. Her father leaned over to see. Someone had recorded a part of the encounter on the street, capturing the moment Randy had grabbed her arm and forced her into the patrol car. The video was already spreading across social media, gaining traction with every minute. "That's good," Jonathan said, though his voice was grim. "The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for them to cover it up." The comments under the video were a mixture of outrage and disbelief. People demanded answers. News outlets had already started reaching out, and activists were calling for Randy's suspension. Layla exhaled slowly, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Not everything," Jonathan said, his expression darkening, "but it gives us leverage." Over the next few days, the pressure on the department mounted. Journalists bombarded the station with questions, and the mayor's office demanded a statement. Jonathan worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and testimonies from anyone willing to speak out against Randy. Layla watched as her father balanced the weight of his responsibilities with the personal anger he carried for what had happened to her. Still, the resistance came swiftly. Some officers tried to undermine the investigation, insisting that Randy had simply been doing his job. Others whispered behind Jonathan's back, calling him a traitor for turning against one of his own. Layla saw the strain it placed on her father, the way it wore him down. But he didn't falter. One night, as they sat together reviewing documents in the living room, Jonathan spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I thought I could change things from the inside. I thought, if I just worked hard enough, I could root out the bad apples." Layla looked at him, her heart aching for the burden he carried. "It's not just a few bad apples," she said softly. "It's the whole tree." Jonathan met her gaze, a flicker of sorrow in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying." A week later, Randy was officially suspended, pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement sparked relief and celebration among those who had been following the case, but Layla knew the fight was far from over. Randy's supporters within the department became more vocal, accusing Jonathan of betrayal. Layla overheard snippets of conversations, officers calling her father a sellout, a man who had turned his back on his brothers in blue. But Jonathan stood firm. "They can say what they want," he told her one evening. "I know what's right. And so do you." As the investigation progressed, more stories about Randy began to surface. Other women came forward with similar complaints, stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The media coverage intensified, and soon the entire city was watching the department's every move. Through it all, Layla remained by her father's side, determined to see the fight through to the end. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, but each time she faltered, she remembered Randy's smug grin, the way he had looked at her as if she were nothing, and she remembered her father's promise. "We'll make this right." Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. The internal investigation concluded, and the department announced that Randy would not only be terminated, but also face criminal charges for misconduct and abuse of power. The news spread quickly, and the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Randy's allies abandoned him, unwilling to be dragged down with him. Jonathan and Layla watched the press conference from their living room, the tension in the air slowly dissolving as the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. For the first time in weeks, Layla felt like she could breathe again. Her father turned to her, exhaustion etched into his features. "It's done," he said quietly. "We did it." Layla nodded, a sense of relief washing over her, but she knew deep down that this was only one battle in a much larger war. "We still have work to do," she whispered. Jonathan smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I know," he said, "but we'll face it together." And as they sat side by side in the soft glow of the television, Layla realized that no matter what came next, she wasn't alone. Together, they would keep fighting, for justice, for accountability, and for a future where no one else would have to experience what she had endured. The battle wasn't over, but they were ready. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it and want to know more such exciting and important stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to come that will turn your ideas of justice and fortitude upside down. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and be sure to watch our other videos. They will definitely not leave you indifferent. Subscribe and stay tuned so you don't miss out.